I've been wanting to build a big medieval castle and a siege for a while now, so today we're going to be doing just that. But before we get started building the battlefield and the castle, we've got to make the attacking army. And who better to be on the offense than Basil the Batlord and his army of loyal cultists? You see, in my medieval LEGO world, Basil is an exiled warlord turned necromancer who used to rule over a large swath of lands called the Ashen Mountain. His years in exile were quiet and mysterious to his former knights that wished to see him return. But for Basil to return home to his long-abandoned fortress and the caves where he grew up, he must first make his way across the rest of the continent. And to do that, he's gonna need an army. Basil may be a necromancer himself, but his army is made up of living men. Most of them are cultists from the western shore of the continent that grew up hearing fishermen tell tales of a wild sorcerer on some far-off island. So when Basil landed in the west, they flocked to his camp to meet the wonder and terror of the Bone Isle. Along with these young cultists are men from the Ashen Mountain that are still loyal to their former commander and wish to join him on his conquest east. So for the actual minifigures themselves, I've tried to add in a fair amount of variation in weaponry. For example, this group of footmen right here carry swords, flails, axes, and spears. They all of course use the Vampire Knight CMF as their base, but I think it still works for a lower ranking soldier in any Fright Knight army. To go along with the group of regular footmen, we've got a couple of armored knights with these sick-looking dual-molded swords, and I've even given this guy a cape and a custom-printed helmet from Cult Bricks. We've also got a couple of archers and some of those commanders that I mentioned earlier. These guys use the backwards Lion Knight torso, which I think works pretty well for some custom Fright Knights. Finally, we have Basil and his two guards that are armed with halberds. I really love how these guys turned out, and while I could go and try to find a couple more of the CMF, I think this army is about the right size to go against the other ones in my collection. Okay, so before we build some siege weapons and a camp for Basil and his Fright Knights, we've got to get started building the terrain for the castle. So I'm laying down a bunch of dirt on the left base plate so that we can then build up a cemetery for all of the long dead Crown Knight kings. We'll place down some vines, mushrooms, and maybe even a pumpkin or two. Now, building this actually gives me the opportunity to use a print that I have been obsessed with ever since it first came out last year. This rune-carved print was such a cool inclusion in the Viking village, so I've yoinked it from that set to use in this mock. Alongside it, I'll place some other custom gravestones, and finally we'll build up a stone wall that divides the graveyard from the road. I learned about this technique for the wall from Edge of Bricks, and I have to say, I really love how this looks. It's a pretty versatile technique and is especially useful for any angled sections of a build like this one. Okay, so the cemetery's done, now time to build the road. I'm using both dark tan and olive green pieces because I think they look really good together, and it makes sense given that this is meant to be a well-trodden and rough pathway towards the castle. You'll notice that I'm actually leaving a little bit of space for things to come later in the build. First of those will be a grassy hill in the middle of the two base plates. I've made the hill with a very basic snot technique that will let us place some rounded slopes on their side to make the hill look a little bit more natural. And on top of the sloped section, I'll place down some plates so that we can build our tree atop the hill. So as this stands right now, there's no way for us to connect this to the rest of our base plate. So we've got to place down some snot bricks and then build up a grassy mound around them. And once that's all done, all we have to do is slide it into place. The tree design that I came up with is pretty similar to the one in the medieval town square, but also kind of similar to the one in the Rivendell set. I went with dark red and regular leaves because I think they give a nice contrast to the green hill that it's growing out of. I was honestly surprised by how nice this ended up looking in the end, as I'm not the best when it comes to using snot bricks. But anyways, now that the hill is done, we can get started on the castle walls. But before we build the castle, let's take a look at the Crown Knight army that will be defending it. First up is the Old King and the Prince of the Crown Knights faction. The Old King is made with that classic gold Crown Knight from I want to say like 2009, and the Prince I've made with some of the 2013 Lion Knight parts. I really love using the minifigures from Castle 2013 as I think they work great as custom Crown Knights. And I only have a couple of real Crown Knights from Fantasy Era, so these torsos will be a really big help in beefing up the army. Now, my absolute favorite unit that I made has to be this ranged one. I've got 2 of these light crossbowmen that use a really classy looking torso and leg combination that I don't think I've ever seen done before, but please correct me if I'm wrong. I really love how these 2 turned out. I think they just look sick, and they're kind of what spurred me on to making this castle to begin with. Anyways, next we've got a couple of armored heavy crossbowmen with those beautiful chromed out kettle helms. And the last 2 ranged units are a couple of longbowmen, this time with chainmail, and again, those chrome kettle helms. Obviously, we're going to need some regular footmen as well, so I've made a pretty diverse group of them with different armor, but all in the same Crown Knights aesthetic. Again, as nice as these 2013 torsos look, I really wish I had a couple more of the Fantasy Era ones. And finally, the last minifigure will be a horseman with a lance. Okay, now the Crown Knight army is done, it is time to finally build the big castle wall. To begin, I'm placing down a bunch of dark gray plates to mark off the inner castle grounds. Also making sure to check with the scale of the front gate that I'll be using. Now that that's done, I can start making a few arrow slit pieces that I'll be adding into the walls on the bottom floor. I've built my walls so that they kind of angle in the middle so that when the attacking army gets close to the gate, the archers can just shoot at them from both sides, only exposing their bows to the enemy. I think this really helps the castle feel a little bit more defensible, which really can't be said for a lot of other LEGO castles. It's an albeit basic technique, but I love how it looks aesthetically, and it makes sense from a realism point of view. Anyways, you'll notice that I've went with the same greebling style that I normally do, just a lot of smaller plates, ingot pieces, snot bricks, and of course the almighty masonry brick. On the outside of these walls, I've also thrown down a couple of small fences for some farm animals that will be added a little bit later in the video. And of course we need to fill in this blank space in the middle with some more plates and tiles. I actually almost ran out of these pieces while building this, so I really need to order some new ones for my next mock. Okay, now going back to the castle walls, we can add a little bit more height to them. I'm trying to get it to the point where we can fit this angled banner in the gap between the 2 walls. The blue and dark tan tiles from the medieval blacksmith are perfect for decorating the walls of a Crown Knight castle, especially because I don't actually have any Crown Knight shields to do it with. So once we've gotten to the appropriate height, we can just add in this section to the 2 walls. Now you might notice that this actually leaves a small hole in the middle of the walkway, but this will make more sense in a second. First, we've got to cover up the bare walls with a walkway on the top. I made sure that this walkway has a bunch of room for archers to stand, and even a spot in the middle for the Crown Knight Prince to observe from. And then all we have to do is place this on top of the castle walls. Now that the walkway is placed on top of the castle, we can add in some barrels of arrows, and even a crate of stones for the knights to throw down on top of the sieging army. Alternatively, you could make a barrel of hot oil to pour down, but I feel like the honorable Crown Knights would have a problem with that, like morally, I don't know. Now, I have decided to keep the interior of the castle pretty basic for the time being because I want a lot of room for the archers to pose down here. Though I do have a couple of weapon racks and a barrel of swords for them. But if I do decide to expand this mock in the future, I'll definitely be improving the interior. Okay, so now that the castle walls are done for now, let's move over to the left side of the battlefield to build the Fright Knights camp. I'm going with red and gray for Basil's tent because I think that just made the most sense for their color scheme. So we've got this little base plate that I can then add a small throne to that I'm actually really proud of considering how small of a space it has to fit inside of. So once the throne's in there, we can just add in these angled panels that are again decorated with gray and red. Once those are on, we can then add a dome piece to make up the bulk of the tent. And to decorate it, I'll just add in this Fright Knights banner from Blue Dragon Bricks. They make a ton of really sweet custom cloth pieces, and I'd highly recommend you all go check them out. I'm also using one of their Fright Knight flags on the top of the tent. And then on the inside, we can just place a Fright Knight cape to act as a banner for the inside. Finally, for some last second additions, I'll place a bust for Basil to place his helmet on, and a barrel for him to store his axe. Then we can simply just add it into the rest of the mock. My inspiration for this tent mostly comes from the many depictions of siege camps in Hollywood. I don't know how historically accurate that is, but it's a fun look either way. And I think it helps balance out the overall scene. Okay, we've only got one more build to do for the Fright Knights, and then we can take a look at the finished battle scene. The Fright Knights had this really small set simply called Crossbow Cart, so I decided to do a little modern spin on it. And I came up with this. It holds a couple of Fright Knight shields, melee weapons, and most importantly, the crossbows. We'll place it down right next to the Fright Knights camp. Okay, now it's time for my favorite part of building a mock, setting up all the minifigures. We'll place down a couple of archers taking cover in the graveyard. a knight falling back after being shot, this guy scaling the green hill, and of course, a ton of archers on the top of the walls. There is a million different ways you could set up this scene, and I'll try to display this mock on my shelf for as long as I can, as I am really happy with how this turned out. It's easily the biggest mock that I've ever built, and I was really nervous going into this video, but I'm really happy with how it turned out in the end. I'm even considering expanding this mock out by adding towers to the sides of the walls, and maybe even completing the full castle, but I don't know yet. Please let me know if you'd like to see this mock expanded in the future, as I had a ton of fun putting this one together. I would love to finish this castle all the way around, and even expanding the graveyard and Basil's camp could be really cool. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you want to see a part 2 to this, please let me know in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching.